340 Southern 2nd 348, second DCA case from 1962, but no negative history according to Westlaw. Stands for the proposition. This was in an insanity case. This is renewing our motion for this trial, Judge, regarding the statements that have come in about Mr. Jonchuck's pattern of behavior, personality, prior bad acts. In this case, the defendant filed notice that he would be relying upon temporary insanity. Their expert testified that he was schizophrenic. He was going to be called for the purpose of stating what psychological examinations he conducted with the defendant, what his findings were, and whether the results of those tests he regarded her as a psychologically normal person. The state objected to the proffer testimony. After hearing argument, the court sustained the objection to the proffer, ruling that the testimony was not admissible. It is apparent, therefore, that the trial judge considered testimony bearing upon the question of defendant's psychological normality to be irrelevant and incompetent to elucidate the issue before the court, that is of legal sanity. It has been long recognized that sanity is the normal condition of a man, and that when charged with a crime, he is presumed to be insane. The mere fact that he has committed a crime is not in of itself sufficient to overcome that presumption. Thus, in prosecution for homicide, the defendant has the burden of establishing the plea of insanity by demonstrating that he was legally insane at the time. They go on to discuss where been McNaughton for a while, don't recognize irresistible impulse or moral insanity as a defense. The only issue presented under the defense of legal insanity is whether the accused at the time of the unlawful act alleged to have been committed by him had a sufficient degree of reason to know what he was doing, that he was doing an act that was wrong. Testimony bearing upon whether or not the defendant was psychologically normal would, as stated by the trial court, be irrelevant to the issue of legal insanity under the standards set forth by McNaughton, to which the state is committed. It must be concluded that the trial judge correctly declared the testimony inadmissible for the objective standard. So, in line with that, I think that's the testimony that I think we have analogous testimony from Dr. Burston regarding his general disposition. Second DCA has held that's not relevant. And then the other case I provided the court is Curtis v. State, 589 Southern 2nd 956, 1991. This is an insanity case regarding statements coming in through an expert. The bigger issue in this case was whether the defendant had opened the door to, obviously, Dr. Burston or any of the state's experts, even though they were allowed to evaluate Mr. Jonchuck, if we did first elicit statements that Mr. Jonchuck made during his evaluation, that they would not be able to do that with their experts. They ultimately said in this case the defense did not get into those statements. The state elicited those statements on cross and then sought to introduce the defendant's convictions to use as impeachment, which would be admissible, but they said it was reversible error under the circumstances because the door had not been opened. More importantly, though, looking at the middle of the third page as printed, in either instance where such facts are elicited from the psychiatrist, the jury is to be given a cautionary instruction to the effect that such statements obtained from the patient by the doctor are used as evidence of mental condition only and not as evidence of the factual truth which may be contained in them.
Okay, as to this one case, Dr. Burston has not testified, nor will I allow him to testify, that the defendant was not psychologically normal. What he has testified to is a series of traits that are consistent with abnormal personality disorder, so I don't find that case on point. And this other one is about the defendant's statements. A cautionary instruction that such statements obtained from the patient by the doctor. Well, your main objection is to the statements that he received from the other people.
Right, but the issue is that it's the cautionary instruction. It's not. It doesn't matter who they come from.
Ms. Manuel, you need to please modulate your voice. Okay, I can hear. You're really, really loud.
Sorry, I
Okay.
always am.
Yeah, I know, but you really, it's hard for me to focus when you're talking to me. So lower it. Just a little, please. Thank you. Go ahead.
I don't remember what I'm saying.
Okay. All right, let's have the jury in, please.
Councilman Deputy Rice, line more clean.
The issue, Judge, is not whether who the statements came from. The issue is when statements are being introduced for a specific purpose, the judge or the jury is to be cautioned about the use of those statements. The jury was taking a whole lot of notes when Dr. Burston went through all of those statements from the other witnesses. They should be told that is not substantive evidence. Substantive evidence is his testimony and the opinions that he's offered, not testimony of the other witnesses. And I did also provide the court, I'm sorry, I forgot, there was, I think, did I provide the court Williams?
No.
Merritt Rich?
Yeah.
549, 7 second, 1071. The proposition regarding the use of we reject the notion that the expert may be used as a conduit for the introduction of otherwise inadmissible testimony. This is a situation where DOC expert was going to testify to a report that had been prepared. He would use the report in forming his opinion. Unless otherwise required by the court, an expert may testify in terms of opinion or references and give his reasonings without prior disclosure of the underlying fact or data. On cross-examination, he shall be required to specify the facts. Going in sum, while it was perfectly proper for the expert to consider the affidavit in formulating his opinion, the affidavit itself was hearsay and inadmissible. This one, and there's a footnote regarding, they did actually give a cautionary instruction, I believe. They said it has been suggested that the trial court can sufficiently instruct the jury to regard the hearsay evidence only as an adjunct of the direct examination to illustrate the basis for the expert opinion and not as substantive evidence, but we agree that the distinction will likely escape the jury. The subterfuge should not be allowed to frustrate accepted hearsay policies. As in certain other areas of evidence law, it would be mythical to expect the jury simply to consider its illustrative effect and disregard its substantive content. And so I think that's even going further to say the curative isn't actually enough. Although they suggested that in this situation the court gave a curative, that doesn't really cure the problem, because you could tell the jury they can't consider it for one reason, they can only consider it for another. But the reality is that they keep hearing all these things, especially in a situation where they're diligently taking notes, that their ability to separate the two is frustrated. We haven't been providing them cautionary instructions all along. We would ask the court to do so now.
Okay, motion denied. In the Williams case, it said we reject the notion that the expert may be used as a conduit for the introduction of otherwise admissible evidence. Dr. Burston is not being used as a conduit for introduction of otherwise admissible evidence. He's testifying as to his opinion or his inference, and if the facts of the data he's relying on are reasonably relied upon by experts, the facts or data need not be admissible in evidence, but they can be admissible in evidence to buttress his opinion, and the defense witnesses were not in any way limited in what they could testify to as what supported their opinion in light of many, many, many states' objections to the contrary. All right, let's bring in the jury, please.
Very good.
Did you want counsel approach, please? You can sit down, we're safe.
There is in the jury box and is seated.
Dr. Burston, before our recess, we were talking about some things that John had told you about panic attacks and feelings of anxiety.
Yes.
You had an opportunity to review records from St. Joseph's Hospital that were provided to you.
Yes.
And in those records, you saw that on December, the night of the 28th and into the 29th of 2014, John presented himself to the emergency room.
Yes.
And it was about 3 o'clock in the morning on the 28th.
I don't remember, but I did review those records.
Okay. He presented with issues of having a racing heart and heart palpitations.
Yes.
And increased blood pressure.
Yes.
And the emergency room did their workup on him.
I read all that, yes.
And in the end, they determined that Mr. Jonchuck was having a panic attack.
Well, they said they thought it was anxiety-based. I don't think they used, I could be wrong, but I'm not sure they used the word panic attack.
I'll stand corrected. They said it was acute anxiety.
Okay. Which could be, to a non-mental health professional, a panic attack.
Okay.
And I think, he had a similar workup in November. We went to the hospital, right? So, as I said earlier, he might have had some panic attacks then. If we're going to talk about what he told me, he talked about having rapid heartbeat, but a panic attack is more of a constellation of other symptoms, and I remember kind of trying to get that from him at the state hospital, and I kind of determined that it was more of a generalized anxiety, and symptoms of generalized anxiety can be, increased, heart palpitations.
Okay, so in talking about that early November trip to the emergency room, you did see where Mr. Jonchuck went to the emergency room November 2nd of 2014?
Yes. Well, I don't have the dates, but beginning of November, yeah.
Would it be helpful to...
No, I trust you. I read the records.
Okay. And again, that was in the middle of the night?
If you tell me it is, I believe you.
Okay. And he presented with acute syncope and acute palpitations?
Yes.
Syncope is what for the jury?
I'm not a medical doctor, so I'm not going to comment on that.
Oh, okay. Jury notes. And that, again, when he presented with those symptoms, the medical doctors thought that there was something going on that was maybe not medically related.
I interpret it as anxiety related.
Okay.
Yes.
And I know you've had a chance to review Dr. Arthur's records, correct?
Yes.
And that Mr. Jonchuck was seeing Dr. Arthur from approximately April of 2011 to December 2013.
Yes.
So that would have been going back, starting some 4 years that he started going there before Phoebe died.
Yes.
Dr. Arthur noted that in his records that he was treating John for the bipolar disorder.
Well, he said bipolar 2. Yes.
And anxiety.
Yes.
And ADHD.
Yes.
And Dr. Arthur also made notes about the problems John was having with his back.
Yes.
And the various tests and things that he was getting done to deal with his back issue.
Yes, and I believe his seizures.
Yes, and that was my next question. Yeah. And you saw in the records that he was sending him out for things and working on the seizure issue.
Yes, he was working very hard for Mr. Jonchuck.
Dr. Arthur made a note in early 2013 that Mr. Jonchuck seemed to be able to get a job but could not hold it due to his psych problems, right?
Yes.
And that had been going on for Mr. Jonchuck for some 3 years at that point.
I don't remember if he said 3 years, but I remember that note, definitely.
Would you like to take a look? Would it refresh your recollection to take a look at the note?
Well, if you tell me it was 3 years, I mean, I know that he talked about his difficulty or inability to hold a job. At one point referred to him as totally disabled after consulting with the neurologist for the seizures. So, yeah, I mean, there's no problem there.
Okay. And in December of 2013, John had lost his insurance.
Well, I don't know that he lost his insurance. I heard that he didn't pay the doctor.
Okay.
And he told me that he just stopped going. I asked him why he stopped. He didn't say anything about insurance. So at any rate, yes, that's when it terminated. As I said, there might be 3 reasons why he stopped going.
Well, separate from what John told you and whoever else told you whatever reason John stopped going, Dr. Arthur indicated in the note that John can't get his insurance now.
Okay, can I see that?
Sure. May I approach? It's highlighted. That is what Dr. Arthur said?
That's what he said, yes.
I'd like to switch focus and talk about this PCL-R for just a moment, okay?
Sure.
This is not a test for insanity, correct?
Most definitely true.
It's not what it was developed for.
No, it's to measure
No, let's move on.
I was trying to.
Okay, ask another question.
It's not what the developer intended it to be used for.
Ms. McNeil, move on.
Would you agree that it is important to be trained to use the PCL-R?
Yes.
And that Dr. Hare sort of has this thing about mandatory training?
Yes, not necessarily with him, but and he has two ways that he and his group provide training, but with other people as well that considered to have a fair amount of skill. So yes, you really do have to be trained.
If you're not properly trained, results could be not valid. Would you agree with that?
It's true with most things.
Would you agree that a person can have psychopathic characteristics and a major mental illness?
Yes.
As you have diagnosed him with, a major mental illness?
Yes.
Would you agree that someone can have psychopathic characteristics and be insane at the time that they do something?
Yes.
There are personality assessments that you can use in your practice, right?
All types, yes.
The MMPI, perhaps?
Yes.
That's a long series of questions that a person answers,
Yes.
and you're able to get a more objective read on a person's personality.
They're called objective personality tests, so yes.
Okay. The PCL-R requires you to put your subjective interpretation on things.
Well, that's certainly true, and hopefully one's subjective interpretation is of a skilled enough quality that it utilizes as much objectivity as possible, but it is still ultimately the examiner's opinion.
Okay. So whereas you referred to the MMPI, for example, as an objective test, the PCL-R is not called an objective test.
No. It's actually not even called a test. It's called a
Let's
checklist.
move on, okay? Council approach, please.
spoke quite a bit about Mr. Jonchuck's financial situation,
Yes,
and you referred to the social security letter that he had with him when he was arrested.
yes.
All right. Showing you what's in evidence as State's Exhibit number 10. May I approach?
Yes.
Have you had an opportunity to see that letter in the course of the discovery and all the things you reviewed?
Yes, I have a copy of it with me.
And this letter indicates that Mr. Jonchuck was to call to talk to the officials at the Social Security office about Phoebe's benefits, correct?
I'd have to review it again to see. I was looking more at the dates, actually. Yes, correct.
Okay. It doesn't say that her benefits are being cut off, correct?
No, it doesn't say, but they said that if he doesn't respond and show proof within 15 days, and the letter's dated December 27th, 2014, the payments will go directly to the Office of Social Security as opposed to going to wherever they were going, which was to him. So he needed to show he was the representative payee for Phoebe Jonchuck, and he's required by law to complete an accounting report, how you saved and how you spent and saved the benefit funds. So, no,
May I approach?
Yes.
they were not
We're
cut.
done. Okay, answer another question. I'm not, Dr. Burson, if you could be responsive to the question, yes
Yes.
or no,
Yes,
and then
ma'am.
explain it, but not go off into
Yes, ma'am.
another world. Thank you.
Okay.
So the letter says John would just have to go to the Social Security office to get the funds.
Well, and show adequate, acceptable documentation showing how the funds were spent on his daughter's welfare.
Okay. And you received John's phone records in discovery as well as part of the records you reviewed?
Some.
Okay. Do you know how many times John called the Social Security office in the days before this happened?
No, I don't.
Would it be important to you that John was trying to address the issue in the Social Security letter and call them and
Well,
take care of it?
While that's a good thing, it doesn't diminish the level of stress associated with that factor. And also, I have to take into consideration, from what he told me himself, that there would be no accounting of it made available to him in terms of receipts, etc. So I don't think I'm stretching much when I say I see that as a problem.
You talked about the collateral sources, the witness interviews and things that you did as part of your own investigation in the case?
Yes, well, part of my evaluation.
Excuse me. At times when you're working on a case, you may reach out to another colleague in your profession, correct?
Yes.
And you in fact did that in this case.
Oh, definitely, yes.
Yes.
did you reach out to a professional colleague in this
Yes,
case?
yes.
And when you reach out to colleagues, well, who did you reach out to in this case?
Dr. Otto.
You've testified quite a bit about how it's important to you to try to be as objective as possible in doing your evaluation.
Yes.
Would you agree that it is important when you are doing witness interviews that you also want to be objective with those people?
Oh, absolutely.
A collateral witness, what are these collateral sources that we've been talking about? A person could get tainted or biased based on what somebody says to them?
Well, certainly. You know, when you're a forensic psychologist, you have to have a tremendous amount of wariness or even distrust when you talk to anyone, because it isn't like treating people where there's a therapeutic relationship. People are in an adversarial circumstance. They have agendas, and they always have to. Every situation, you have to take that into consideration. So obviously, when I talk to collaterals, I don't drop those guards. I have to use the same level of psychological inquiry skills as I do when I'm doing a direct face-to-face evaluation. So certainly I had an awareness of potential for bias, potential, particularly in this situation, for getting back at, okay, for obvious reasons. What was most impressive to me is in all of the 8 people I spoke with, what I was told was incredibly consistent.
Improper.
Just responsive to the question.
If I heard different things, I would have to somehow sort all that out. Can't pick what I like and discard the rest. But without a doubt, everyone I spoke to gave me the same type of information, and I was calling about Mr. Jonchuck, obviously. So in this circumstance, to the best of my professional ability, I had to take that into very firm consideration, and actually that was probably a big decision maker of mine to consider administering the psychopathy checklist revised. Because again, everybody described certain traits and characteristics.
Okay. Did you rely on these collateral sources in developing your opinion about this case?
They were one aspect of my data pool in arriving at an ultimate decision.
Is it fair to say that in speaking with John's family and friends, no one was particularly happy with John?
I don't think, given the circumstances, anyone would say that. Did I encounter anyone who was overtly angry, hostile, who I felt was trying to trash him? No. Do I think that they were happy with him? Some people discussed how traumatized they were, and that's understandable. But it was more like that, traumatized by the situation and his role in the situation. I didn't feel that there was any out-to-get-himness. And again, I found these people, and of course, you know, I understand that these are Mr. Jonchuck's social world, okay? So I understand that these people have their own issues. But again, I was very, very impressed by the consistency in what they had to say.
Move on, please.
If the information that is provided to you during a collateral interview, if facts or circumstances that are relayed to you are not factually accurate, and I'm not talking about characteristics here. I'm talking about factual scenarios, okay?
Mm-hmm.
If those factual scenarios are not accurately reported, that could affect your opinion, right?
Well,
Dr. Burson, if you could answer yes or no and then explain, it would be helpful.
it could affect my opinion, but I don't just rely on what I'm hearing. I try to cross-reference with whatever documentation, deposition, police report type of documentation that I review. And I understand that no one's a 100% accurate reporter in terms of facts.
You did not investigate the criminal histories of any of the collateral witnesses that you interviewed, correct?
I see no relevance to that.
Okay, so you did not.
No.
The interview that you had with John's biological mother, Michelle
Yes.
Jonchuck, you tried a couple times to get her on the phone and set up appointments,
Yes,
and she did not follow through.
correct.
And it wasn't until she was under a subpoena that you were able to talk to her.
Well, not exactly. She came into the state attorney's office under subpoena, and I was there. And the idea was that they were going to talk to her and ask her if I was allowed to listen. She volunteered to talk with me, and I primarily conducted that interview. There was no coercion. She was very, very nice, and she discussed the reason she didn't call back. She told me primarily was that this whole thing was very stressful to her.
Okay. So you met with Ms. Jonchuck on February 13th, 2018, is that correct?
Got to give me a second to make sure. Yes, correct.
Okay. And that was at the state attorney's office,
Yes,
and the assistant state attorneys were present,
correct.
and Ms. Jonchuck was under subpoena at the time.
Yes, although not to talk with me specifically.
And you learned that John's mom had been in and out of his life,
Yes,
that she had a history of substance abuse
yes,
and some mental illness issues of her own,
yes,
and that she had spent time in and out of jails and prison throughout John's life.
absolutely true.
When you met with John's father, John Jonchuck Sr., you met with him at the state attorney's office.
Immediately after meeting with his mother, same circumstances.
Okay. John Sr. went to the state attorney's office, right? And the assistant state attorneys were there,
Yes,
and he was under subpoena,
to speak with them, yes.
and you spoke with them at that same time.
Well, after discussing whether he wanted to talk with me, yes, I did.
And none of the defense team was there for either the interview with John Sr. or John's mom.
Sustained.
Your impression of John Sr., John's dad, was that he was not really the most insightful person, right?
No, by that I mean he's not a psychologically minded individual focused on feelings and more touchy-feely type of stuff. I mean, he lives in a different world.
Okay. And doesn't have such a great belief in mental illness.
Well, he understood that John had problems throughout his life and actually tried to get him help when he was young. Again, I don't think he's the most psychologically minded in terms of understanding those things, but
When you spoke,
Dr. Burson, could you, yes or no? That's the question again that you asked.
I don't know.
You don't know what you asked.
That he was not he didn't have such a great belief in mental illness.
if I had to go one way or the other, I would say
I'm going
that
to
that's true.
speculation, Your Honor.
Oh, roll.
I didn't hear the
I would say
answer.
that if I had to go one way or another, because I think there's shades of gray here, but to please the court, I will say I will go more with he doesn't have a great appreciation of mental illness. Yes.
When you spoke with John Sr. about what he would do with John when John was a child, because you talked to us yesterday about, I guess, from when he was a baby and the bonding and all of that, when John was a young child and would be acting out, John Sr. would physically restrain him?
Yes, and actually there was a lot of physical violence perpetrated towards Mr. Jonchuck here from Mr. Jonchuck Sr., yes.
He would wrap him in a sheet at times?
Yes.
To try to restrain him? Talking about those bonding and attachment issues that you spoke of yesterday, I mean, you were starting from when John was just a baby, right?
Yes.
And all the issues he had going with his mom, with her being in and out of jail,
Yes.
and not being able to bond with her. I mean, I kind of gathered that's what you were telling us all that yesterday.
That's my assessment, yes.
And that lack of bonding that he experienced as a child sort of grew and morphed into more behavioral problems as he got older.
Well, it can be the foundation for, as I said, major personality disturbance. And certainly, if I look at the bonding issues with vis-a-vis, look at it through the family history, he and his mom particularly, and I look at the trajectory of his life, it's pretty clear that bonding failures had, in my opinion, a lot to do with who Mr. Jonchuck became. And again, I said early diagnosis of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, which complicated things.
You described problems in John's childhood yesterday as having impulsivity.
Yes.
And anger.
Yes.
And inappropriate behavior.
Yes.
And you would agree with me that those things that he experienced as a young child were not his fault.
Objection, Judge. No speculation.
Overall.
Well, I think with every child to a certain age.
Yes or no, and then you can explain.
No, they were not his fault at a very young age.
And you saw that, and that John, I think you testified to this, that John had multiple psychiatric hospitalizations prior to the age of 12.
That's what he reported, yes.
And the hospitalizations he had in his later years as a teenager were due to things he did to injure himself.
Yes.
Stabbing himself, right?
Yes.
And intentionally trying to overdose?
Yes.
And John started in an outpatient mental health treatment sort of program around the ages of 4 or 5, right?
Yes, that's what I was told, yes.
I'd like to move on and talk about John's uncles. You testified to some stuff that his Uncle Brian had told you about?
Yes.
Uncle Brian did not feel a strong or a positive relationship to John, correct?
No, their relationship went south, I believe when Mr. Jonchuck was about 19 or 18, between 18 and 20, evidently Mr. Jonchuck attacked his step-grandmother, and that led to the end of that relationship.
Okay. His Uncle Brian had not heard from John for some years until right before Phoebe died.
Right, the emails that dealt with the Chinese drywall and the food spoiling, yes, correct.
And you told us yesterday about John's sexual history, I guess. You learned from John that it was his uncles that outed him as being gay, correct?
I can't say I remember that they outed him. I can't say that I recall that.
Okay. Do you have your notes from the evaluation?
Yes.
Be on day 2, somewhere around 3:30 p.m.
we approach the judge?
No.
Are you waiting for me?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I'm so sorry. In the area where I discussed the sexual history with him, I don't have any information about that, so I don't have that in my notes.
You don't have that they told everyone before John came downstairs that he was gay? And they all said, we know your secret now? And that's how the family found out?
No, I don't have that in my notes.
Would it be fair to say that you also then did not ask the uncles about that?
That's probably fair, but let me look and see if they said anything about that. No, I don't see that in here. No.
Okay. You also talked yesterday about the jelly on in the apartment at the uncle's house?
Yes.
Okay. I don't know if the jury heard. What age was John when the jelly incident happened?
I think it was somewhere between 3 and 6, 3 and 5.
Okay. Would it refresh your recollection to look at your report to get the age?
Sure.
Your report, page 9. About 8 lines up from the bottom.
Just at page 9.
Correct.
Age 4.
Okay, age 4 when the jelly spilled.
Yes, that's...
And
yes.
you talked to John during the evaluation about the jelly incident, right?
Yes.
All right. And John told you that he dumped the jelly out to try to catch a frog, right?
Well, that's what he told me, yes.
To use the jar to capture a frog.
Well, that's what he said, yes.
Yeah, okay.
He denied that he threw the jelly at all.
You've spoken at length about John's financial issues and that people said he manipulated other people to get what he wanted, right?
Yes.
You know that John fell at a restaurant at a cheesecake factory?
Yes, I heard about that.
And he had a lawyer
Yes,
and filed a lawsuit,
yes,
and that was related to his back injuries.
correct.
And the reason why they inserted a device in his back, a spine stimulator.
Yes,
Okay. And that case was set to go to trial about 2.5 months after Phoebe died.
that's what I heard, correct. Now, you brought up that fall.
I'm going to object as non-responsive to the question. Okay. And when you spoke yesterday about the pre-settlement loans,
Yes,
those pre-settlement loans had to do with that Cheesecake Factory lawsuit, right?
yes,
And John used that money to put down a contract on a condo, a rent-to-own contract.
yes,
And he used that money to get a place for he and Phoebe to stay together, right?
yes.
And he was kind of proud of that. when he
Well,
told
I
you
don't
about
blame him for doing, he did get a condo, definitely.
He got a newer car,
Yes,
and he bought a new set of bedroom furniture for Phoebe.
yes,
And John thought it was quite nice, really nice, to be in their own place without all the drama, right?
that's what he said, yes. So, of course, he did have roommates there throughout that year.
And then after a period of time, there was a I don't know, a problem with maintenance, or a plumber had to come out. Remember?
Well, I think he was accused of wrecking the plumbing.
And then he had to leave that.
Well, he
Condo.
admitted to me that he defaulted on the whole thing.
Right, and he did admit that to you, right?
Yes, yes.
He didn't hide it.
No, didn't hide it.
I want to talk to you a little bit about Michelle Kerr. You've testified that this pattern, this thing was growing in John because of the concern about custody, right?
Yes,
And you said that John was fearful because of Michelle's relationship with Guy.
well, this was going on over time, but I believe that after the first visit in November, the second visit in December, that there was some concern. Of course, as I said today, Mr. Jonchuck also, after the December visit, felt that it wasn't the most savory place for his daughter to go. And he expressed that to his attorney.
Yes.
Where was I at? Michelle and Guy. You've been testifying that John had concerns about that relationship, right?
Both positive and negative.
Right.
When I say positive, that it was an established bond, boyfriend-girlfriend relationship, and that could affect the circumstances with the custody issue. And he also had concerns that it was a very unhealthy relationship, and so that could inflame his concerns about the custody issue as well.
Okay. And John actually made a report to the Department of Children and Families about Michelle and Guy.
Yes.
And what was going on at their house.
And across the street with drugs, yes.
Yes. And John similarly filed for an injunction against Michelle
Yes.
on that same day, December 30th.
Yes.
And that wasn't the first time that John had applied for an injunction against Michelle.
No, there had been back and forth injunctions filed. But certainly he did file them, and certainly the domestic violence between them was mutual.
And John had one, I mean, he had an injunction in place against Michelle in 2013, correct?
I can't speak to the date, but I know that he had ones previously, yes, most definitely.
And the court order allowed for Michelle to see Phoebe.
Yes.
At the daycare.
Yes.
And at child visitation places.
Yes.
So you spoke to Michelle Kerr.
On the phone, yes.
She tells you about the drug abuse and use?
His or hers?
Hers.
I knew about it elsewhere. I'd have to look and see if she brought it up herself. Again, I wasn't evaluating her. I was aware that she has her own set of significant mental health issues.
Okay.
There was no doubt about that from what I gathered prior to speaking with her.
Okay.
But in terms of drugs, let's see what she said. Well, she told me when they hooked up together, you know, they had been drinking heavily. That was part of the bonding process between them.
She and Guy.
No, I'm talking about Mr. Jonchuck.
Oh, I was talking about Guy Kisser.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry.
So you're aware Michelle has, as you just put it, her own set of problems.
Yes.
Okay. One of the things that would cause John distress was when Michelle was using Phoebe's name for her online activities.
Is one of the reasons, yes.
Craigslist activities?
Yes, most definitely had that all going on. She had other names, but, you know.
You testified yesterday about that John's mom, Michelle, gotta get this right, Michelle told you that John got in trouble for this scanner and printing checks.
She told me about it, and of course, his uncle told me about it, yes.
And actually what happened is that the police were called for an unrelated incident, and John told the police that Michelle was doing all this stuff, right?
I can't recollect that.
Would looking at a police report help refresh your recollection?
Yes.
Dr. Burson, in
Yes.
relation to this scanner and printer thing you
Yes.
talked about yesterday?
Yes.
That came from John's mom's, somebody told you that, right?
Yes, the uncle told me about it in great detail, and he discussed it in great detail in his deposition.
I'm just asking for the source of the information.
Yes.
Okay. You haven't actually seen any police reports about that, correct?
No.
Okay.
No.
That's all I had for that. Thank you. Let's talk about Noemi. You've been saying that sorry, Noemi.
Yes.
You said that you reviewed the information that John was texting and calling her on the night of January 7th?
Yes.
And Noemi is somebody that you spoke to,
Yes.
and Noemi did not want to have anything to do with John, correct?
At which time?
On January 7th.
That's correct.
She had described living with John as sort of mayhems and problems and conflict, I think were the words you used yesterday.
Yes.
But yet, John was texting her and calling her and trying to get in touch with her on the night of January 7th.
Now, my understanding is he actually was in the parking lot, her parking lot, doing that. Yes.
And Noemi said, "There's not a chance. We have nothing doing right now.
Well,
I don't want anything to do with him."
She told him to go away, and he wasn't allowed in the house. Yes.
Well, and you had talked a little bit about how John would reach out to people and try to look for places to stay, and you talked about that with his residential situation, right?
Yes.
It certainly didn't appear to you, based on your conversation with Noemi, that was something that she would have any interest in doing.
She had lived with him in the past, so in the past she obviously did have some interest in doing that. They were just roommates. There was no
Right.
But no, at that time she had no interest. And as I testified to yesterday, he had made similar inquiries about living with her in December.
Did you see any pictures of the texts that John and Noemi exchanged?
I don't believe so.
You've reviewed the documentation and presumably, I think you were in the courtroom when Attorney Torres testified?
I listened to her testimony, yes.
So not to rehash everything that she testified to, but in a nutshell, she was so concerned about John's behavior on January 7th that she called the police.
Yes.
And she called DCF.
Yes.
And you have heard that when John was meeting with Attorney Torres on January 7th, he was very religiously preoccupied.
Yes.
Very preoccupied with the Bible.
Correct.
And being overly religious and delusional.
Yes.
And would you agree with me that someone who is having psychotic symptoms can still drive a car?
Oh, definitely, yes.
Go to the grocery store?
Yes.
Make dinner?
Yes.
Make an appointment?
Yes.
Keep the appointment?
Not in every case, but it certainly is possible. It depends on the degree of psychosis. So being psychotic doesn't exclude those things, but being real psychotic, floridly psychotic, might very well exclude any or all of those things.
Psychotic symptoms can sort of wax and wane?
Well, they seem to have been for Mr. Jonchuck
Okay.
at the time we're talking about.
The people that you talked to and the impression that you got from looking at records and depots and everything, everyone gave you the same opinion about John's love for Phoebe, right?
Yes,
That he loved her very much.
yes.
No one disputed that.
No one disputed that.
When you describe, well, your opinion of your contact with John's mom and all the other documentation you read about that, John's mom thought that in late 2014 he had some preoccupation with religion, right?
Yes.
But she said it was sort of mild.
Well, actually, she talked about it more, the very end of 2014, beginning of 2015, yes.
Same with his dad, same impression. He'd been talking about religion, but it's just mild.
I think that would be the way to put it. It wasn't all encompassing. He didn't talk about it exclusively, but he did bring it up at times, yes.
They did not think that he was out of touch with reality.
No, they didn't.
And they both just kind of described it was John's patterns of thinking and feeling and behaving. They were really kind of normal, right?
Well, his father certainly talked to him and said, "What's up with this religion?" And John said, that's essentially what I recall the father saying. And John said nothing. He said verbally the words, nothing.
When it turned to January 7th, John was, I'm going to go to the sort of the evening and then we're going to back up. In the evening, John's mom came over to his dad's house.
Yes.
Where John, his dad and stepmom and Phoebe were all at.
Yes.
And they were having dinner.
Yes.
And the whole reason John's mom came over was because she was going to pick Phoebe up and take her home with her, right?
And give him $100.
And then she was going to take Phoebe to work She was going to take Phoebe to daycare in the morning so John could go to work.
Yes.
It's obviously not what happened that night, right?
That's correct.
Because Phoebe wanted to stay with her dad.
Yes.
John called his mom later in the evening and asked if he could bring Phoebe over, right?
I think he wanted them both. My recollection is he wanted to bring them both over. He
Right.
wanted to go with her for the night.
Okay. All right. So Phoebe had been living, for the most part, with John's mom between October and December of 2014?
Well, into January.
And into January?
Yes.
Right. Right.
3rd, right?
Okay.
Yes.
And you know that John reached out to Michelle to have Thanksgiving with her and Guy.
Yes.
I should be more clear. John reached out to Michelle Kerr about he and Phoebe having Thanksgiving with Michelle Kerr and Guy.
Kisser.
Right.
Yes.
And then after that Thanksgiving dinner, Phoebe spent some more time with Michelle during the month of December.
Yes.
Because Phoebe wanted to see her, so John took her over.
Correct.
And then they had Christmas.
Correct.
And we've heard a lot about Christmas
Yes.
with John's mom and everything. And at one point during Christmas, Guy said that John had been standing outside sort of talking or mumbling to himself.
He went outside to smoke, and Guy Kisser either went outside to smoke or to see where John was, and he saw that John was smoking a cigarette and had his head down and was mumbling to himself, yes.
during your evaluation with John, you asked him if he, Mr. Jonchuck, was feeling threatened at all by Phoebe's relationship with his mom, right?
With Michelle Kerr.
No, with
with
Michelle
his-
Jonchuck, with his
Yes,
mom.
I did.
Yeah?
Yes, yes,
Okay. And he said that he did not feel threatened by that.
correct.
Around Christmas time, John began to hear voices
Yes,
and experienced some other psychotic symptoms.
yes,
He would hear his mother calling his name when she wasn't there.
that's what he said, yes.
He heard voices that were very self-deprecating.
Yes, putting him down, yes.
And we come to January 5th. Let's back up. January 3rd, Uncle Brian starts getting the weird text messages about the Chinese drywall
Yes,
and the food spoiling.
yes,
And Phoebe's eyes looking weird.
yes,
And they're being black on the walls.
yes,
And John's mom checked all that out. And
correct,
the walls were not black and Phoebe's eyes were okay.
correct.
To the night of January 5th, the night when John started yelling at his mom in the middle of the night, right?
Yes,
When he started speaking to her, he was speaking to her as though he, John, were his mom's mom, right?
yes.
Like he was a different person.
You could say that, yes.
Okay. He told you he was feeling very weird around this time.
I think he told me that he made that reference to mid-December.
Okay. Yes, in general. I'm
Well,
not
in
saying
general,
specifically.
obviously,
January.
he was having symptoms, yes.
So he reported at times during this period feeling on top of the world,
There was some of that, yes,
and that he wasn't feeling the need for much sleep.
yes,
John told you that after Christmas, the voices told him not to eat,
yes,
and that he was going to hell,
correct,
and that he was being cursed out by the voices and they wouldn't stop.
yes,
He became preoccupied with religion
yes,
and the Bible,
correct.
and thinking that Phoebe was possessed by a demon.
Well, he made those statements, but again, based on my review of the records, as I said earlier, this was not going on consistently throughout the day. There were statements, episodes, which I think that they were real for him, and then there were times where that didn't seem to be a preoccupation, a problem. As I said yesterday, I'm the Pope. No, I'm not the Pope. I think that's a good example of how I see things.
Well, and John put salt around the doors and windows.
Yes, about a week before Phoebe's death, yes.
He was sleeping with the Bible.
Yes,
He thought the Bible was making noise.
yes,
He was telling his mom and stepmom about this.
yes.
He was dragging them around to the churches.
He dragged his stepmother
stepmom.
around, yes.
But they thought he was kind of just maybe a little talking about religion, but he was okay.
Well, again, they didn't see all of that, and when they did see him, for example, he made that very reality-based plan on the evening of the 7th with his mother that he would take Phoebe to school, she'd pick him up, and she would, and then they'd have dinner at Michelle Jonchuck's house.
Right.
So there were episodes, periods of time, when I say episodes, where he was thinking in a logical, step-by-step manner. And my review of the records, as I tried to point out earlier today, there were definitely indications of reality testing. And as I said earlier today, there was unraveling, clearly, but there was reality testing.
So in between the point of, let's say, getting the $100 from his mom to take to Attorney Torres the next morning and, making the plan that Phoebe would go with her, and that John's mom would take Phoebe to school the next day, that being intermixed with John wanting to put Phoebe's hands on the Swedish Bible so that the people could hear it chanting.
Are you saying that he did that on the night of the 7th?
So, well,
Are you saying that?
you're testifying.
No, I'm trying to understand your question.
Is that a reality-based thing? Hands on the Bible for the chanting?
I would say not in this case.
Oh, and I think we said this, but just to make sure, the reason why John said he put the salt around the doors and the windows was to keep the evil spirits out, right?
Yes.
He reported to you that he went to the church to ask Father Caesar about possession?
Yes.
And when John relayed the events of that day and evening to you, things were not in the same chronological order as what the police reports and all the other documentation supports, right?
I'd have to look because I asked him, kind of from his blow-by-blow account. So just give me a second.
Okay.
Well, he told me he went to the attorney, went to Father Caesar, he went to Father Bill Swingros, went to the other church where there was no one to speak to him, and he told the lady at the front desk that he was the Pope. And then he told me that he went home and took a nap, and then had the dinner with his parents.
Would you agree with me that if somebody is experiencing a psychotic episode, that can have an effect on how they create memories in their brain?
It can, yes.
And that could also then have an effect on how memories are relayed to a person who is asking about it sometime later?
Yes, definitely.
John reported to you, and you've seen and read in the documentation, that John wanted his attorney to read the Bible to him because of her accent, right?
Yes.
And
Well, he thought more her accent meant other things. Yes.
and John thought that she was a saint
Yes.
and various other people, and that she had come from Babylon that day. Okay.
Yep.
Pretty much John's entire interaction with Attorney Torres on January 7th concerned her.
Definitely.
When John spoke to Father Bill, John has reported at various times that he was looking for an exorcism, right?
I don't believe Father Bill said that he ever asked for an exorcism.
Right, okay, so you saw that in the records.
Yes, I did.
John returned to St. Paul's Catholic Church with his stepmom a couple hours after he had first been there, right?
Yes.
And you testified about that earlier, and that you saw that as a sign that he wanted to show that everything was really okay.
Well, that's the location where police met with him, and coming back with a family member and who's also there with the child speaks to that there's a family system in place that should reduce any concerns any people might have about him.
And I think that was one of the examples you gave of reality checking or reality checking in.
Well, I think it shows that, and it shows that he knows that he had some problems at the church, at the police, and he's trying to cover those bases. I'm not saying that in a negative way. I think he was taking care of business.
John's reported that he took his stepmom there, he took Mickey there to prove to Father Bill that she was alive, right?
Yes.
Later in the day, late afternoon, early evening, John was wanting his various family members, mom, stepmom, dad, to put their hand on the Bible.
That was his report, so it was not corroborated by anyone I spoke to.
Right. Right. John reported to you that he was afraid that he said his dad was kind of, when he reported this to you, that his dad was kind of irritable when he got home that day?
Yes.
And John said he was afraid that his dad was going to do something to hurt him or Phoebe?
Well, he said he went to the knife drawer and he thought maybe he was going to pull out a knife and hurt someone.
And his dad reprimanded John over this whole interest in the Bible.
Well, this is what John's stating. Again, the father has a different story.
Right. John reported to you that when he laid down with Phoebe for a while that evening, that he was paranoid that people were trying to get them.
That's what he told me, yes.
And that he texted his mom about the Ice Age.
Which she denied. She said he actually texted him about the plans the next day. Again, him dropping Phoebe off at school, etc. Yes.
Okay. He said he left with Phoebe to go as far south as he could go.
That's what he said, yes.
John told you that it's Phoebe who brought up the fact that the police lights were on.
Yes, she said something. He told me that she said something to the effect of what are those lights for?
The documentation shows, the police reports show what really happened is that John pulled over on top of the bridge and then the officer put his lights on, correct?
I understand that, yes.
Okay. You asked John what he meant when he said you have no free will to the officer?
Yes.
And John told you he didn't know?
Correct.
You gave the jury what your opinion is as to what that meant?
Yes, I did.
Okay. John told you that he released Phoebe because he was hearing the voices?
Yes.
That
And he told me that he had the belief that he and Phoebe had to die to save the world.
Okay.
And he told me the voices heard the devil's voice.
Right. And if they both had to die or everyone was going to hell?
Yes.
You said a little bit ago that on direct that you knew, I don't know if that's the right way to say it, it's your opinion that John knew that the person standing in front of him was a police officer,
Yes.
and yet he still released Phoebe,
Yes.
with the officer standing there with the firearm on him.
Yes.
And so then he calmly gets back in his car and drives away,
Yes.
going south,
Yes. I don't think. Yes.
Then-
going south.
going south, and
Yeah.
then turns and goes north.
Correct.
And then you indicated that John had then made the U-turn with the blinkers right in front of
Yes.
the police officer?
Yes.
When the police officer had his lights on?
Yes.
All right. And you said that was John's attempt to avoid apprehension?
Well, I'm talking about, yes, with the police officer behind him, yes.
Okay.
Yeah, he pulled over and then he went the other way, made a U-turn.
And you also said that a sign of John's reality checking, I feel like you used a different word for that and I'm using the wrong one, but reality checking was that he was avoiding oncoming cars.
Well, I think at that moment, he was in the here and now. He didn't think that he was God and the cars couldn't hurt him, or every time he got 5 feet away from an oncoming car, his car would levitate. So it tells me that at least in terms of driving, he was trying to get away and protect himself in the process.
The police reports aren't consistent with the fact that he tried to avoid the oncoming cars.
Well, I not initially, but as he drove away, there was an issue of driving towards a police officer's car, which that was part of a charge upon arrest. But otherwise, other cars he was driving defensively. It was, I believe, it was described as.
After John was taken into custody, he talked about the fallen angel Michael.
When he was first stopped, yes.
He talked about the city of Babylon.
Yes.
When he's at the Manatee County Sheriff's Office, he asked if they could let him go.
Yes.
On his way to jail, he asked if the officer could take him to Babylon.
Yes.
Or the airport.
Yes.
Okay. When you spoke with John, you didn't ever ask him about suicide by cop, right?
No.
Nor did you see that in any of the other reports from any of the other examiners?
No.
Okay. And you sat through all of the testimony by our experts, correct?
Yes, yes, I did.
And you spoke with the state attorneys in between crosses and directs and things?
Jackson, quick question.
Yes.